The First World War was a fight on a level never before imagined. The majority of the world was consumed by a single war, testing the alliances of nations as well as the patriotism of civilians. As a result of the international tensions, countries became consumed by propaganda campaigns, espionage plots and rumors, and unfortunately, a level of mistrust and misunderstanding that divided communities. The United States, unfortunately, was not immune to this trend, resulting in the growing level of anxiety all over the United States alien citizens, but especially for German and German Americans. In the years leading up to World War I, Nashville's very own German community began to face the same level of scrutiny as other German communities throughout the United States. Once the war was officially declared by the U.S., the tensions unfortunately increased even more. As a result, Nashville's German community was faced with many difficult situations, from expressions of their own heritage and patriotism to questions of naturalization and responsibilities towards their own community. So to start off, we're going to just open up with some questions, and then the panelists will be kind enough to add into their thoughts and hopefully create a wonderful dialogue. At the end, we will open it up for questions for the audience in case anyone else has more inquiries that aren't covered. So, what were the original reasons German migrants chose to settle in Nashville?
I can answer that question, I think, and I'll be delighted to have help from all of you and the audience as well. Germans were here from the time of the first European settlers. They came into this area. There was just a tremendous amount of movement going on here. Now, to set the stage for this, we have these 13 colonies on the eastern coast hugging the Atlantic Ocean with relationships with Europe. Yes, they were English colonies, but keep in mind that William Penn, when he came in and founded Pennsylvania, it became, that in New York became the most diverse colonies of the 13. They actually welcomed people from the continent of Europe, Germans, French, Scandinavians. They welcomed them because they wanted laborers. And Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, had a great influx of immigration, people coming from Europe. So they began moving westward towards Pittsburgh, towards the Appalachian Mountains, and there is a very distinct path that they made down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains into, eventually, into Tennessee. These were people looking for a place to stop. And so from the beginning, there were Jews coming into Philadelphia and New York City, and then coming on this westward migration, but there were also a significant number of Germans. There was a great influx of Germans into Pennsylvania and then moving westward. Among the very earliest of the Germans, we have two Germans who are here pretty much before the beginning, before the signing of the Cumberland Compact, and they signed the Cumberland Compact. One was Caspar Mansko, a long hunter was what he was called. They left Virginia and came over and hunted for a long period of time and then went back with the furs that they could sell. He settled on a creek just north of downtown Nashville, Manskers Creek, the border between Sumner County and Davidson County. And he ended up, when James Robertson's group, the men on foot and the others who had joined him arrived, he is here as well. And one of the people who had joined up with the Robertson Party coming in 1779 and early 1780 was Frederick Stumpf. And Frederick Stumpf came in as well. He also signed the Cumberland Compact. So we know that two people of German descent signed the Cumberland Compact for sure. Now, the population of the Germans here grew rather slowly, but especially the Stumpfs became the catalyst for a thriving community of immigrants from Germany. While we were focused over here in the War of 1812 and General Jackson's exploits down in Horseshoe Bend and in New Orleans, in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars had just ended, and a meeting was held in Vienna to try to kind of settle up the map of Europe post-Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna, and what is known as the Final Act, in which these German states were divided kind of officially, and Vienna and Austria really were, by most historians' account, the big winners in that Peace of Augsburg, that treaty that was signed there in 1815. We began seeing Germans coming this way, and they come to Tennessee. There were many people who came here, stayed a while, and they went on to Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, well before the Civil War. I think it's important, Amy, to mention that there was xenophobia here in Nashville from the 1840s up past the Civil War. For example, we had had two political parties here since the time of Andrew Jackson, the Democrats, Jackson's party, and the anti-Jackson Whig Party. And the Whigs, as they had died out in the late 1840s and early 1850s, they had been replaced by a party that called themselves the American Party or the Know-Nothing Party. And they were particularly irate about immigrants. And so their wrath towards immigrants had it to do with anybody who had any inkling of a European heritage, that they still followed the tradition, spoke the language, worshiped any group. So that, of course, meant German Catholics who were here. And to some degree, it meant the German Methodists who were here. You know, above Austria, those states of Germany tended to be Protestant and Lutheran, and below, they were Catholic. And so there was a great deal of criticism of them, but if they were assimilated into the community, they were not treated badly at all. But an interesting thing about all the mayors of Nashville, from about 1851 or 2 till after the Civil War, these were people who were members of this American Party, which was very much an anti-immigrant party. Now, I'm leaving all the discussion of Jewish history and the Jewish coming to Jean here, but I do want to make a couple of points about the Jews who were here who really assimilated into our society. One was George Dury, who had been one of those Wartburg Jews. I bet so there are a few of you who don't even know where Wartburg, Tennessee is. It's over in Morgan County, and it was a colony of Jews but who were sold land by a land speculator, and the Germans came into Wartburg, and Wartburg Germans came to Nashville. They did not find the land over there really very satisfactory at all. So these were not Jews. These were just Germans who were coming to the United States and specifically to Tennessee. But George Dury was among those Wartburg Germans. He was a Protestant. He was not a Jew. He was a Protestant, if I misstated that. And another one who came was Adolphus Hyman, an engineer. Dury was a portrait painter. His name is still on a business here in town, a photography business. Adolphus Hyman joined the Confederate Army. He was an architect. He was killed during the Civil War, but he was of the German heritage. And so after the Civil War, Dury continued his work, and Hyman became quite a Civil War hero. He was memorialized greatly here. Now, probably the most colorful of all the Germans who came into town was Edward Bushrod Stallman. He had come into Middle Tennessee as a civilian railroad worker hired by the Union Army when the Confederates blew up South Tunnel, which is up in Sumner County. And he eventually got a job with the L&N Railroad, and then he moved to Nashville, bought the Nashville Banner. And he had colorful opinions about everything. And so when Luke Lee started and bought the Nashville Tennessean and then the American, the debate between them became very intense. And I will talk about that a little bit later. But we have a lot of German organizations here in town, a German Methodist Church, which changed its name to Barth Memorial Methodist Church. We have German bakeries and many German businesses here at the time World War I started.
I would just like to add that Jews have been in Nashville for a long time, from 1795 on. We know we have a record of a couple, second marriage for them, but they were on horseback and they came and stayed in Nashville while the wife had a baby, and then they left. But their children came back, and the Powers, you probably have run into that name, Carol, the Powers children were here. So Jews have a long history in Nashville. But there's something about Jewish background I think you have to understand. Two things, actually. Number one, Jews have lived in the diaspora for centuries. They've always had to adapt and try to assimilate. They've been strangers in a strange land. And they have tried to do it well, and in most cases they have been business people supplying goods like dry goods and groceries, and maybe developing into department stores while others became peddlers. And that's how the initial Jewish population in Nashville became more numerous. Most of the initial Jews that came to Nashville came through Cincinnati, the Queen City, where they were somewhat helped in figuring out peddling routes or having money to begin businesses, because Nashville was a frontier city, and people were getting their things here before their long trek to the west. So there were plenty of business opportunities. So the first thing is the diaspora that is part of all Jewish history. The second thing, and unfortunately this is rising again now, is anti-Semitism. And there are Jewish historians who think that during the Civil War was absolutely the worst period of anti-Semitism. There were at least 2 murders here in Nashville, and yet we also know that Jews during the Civil War were very much a part of the Confederacy. Over 19 Jewish men volunteered. A number were not only sympathizers, but smugglers. And several went to prison for helping the Confederacy. I also have to say, one Jewish man supported the Union. Because of Nashville's middle-of-the-state position, there were a number of families, of course, that were for the Confederacy, but there were also some for the Union. So anyway, that happened among Jews. Jews were anxious to be a part of the community, and they definitely showed their support for the Civil War, and eventually, when we get into it, for World War I.
Thank you. Between 1820 and 1914, 6 million Germans immigrated from Germany to the United States. The reason I bring that up, that statistic, is that now in this country, 47 million Americans trace their ancestry to at least one German ancestor. That's the largest ethnic group by far, even greater than Irish. It's 15% of the almost a sixth of the American population. That's why the turn of events leading up to World War II was really so extraordinary, because Germans had already made, there was a big cross-cultural connection. Germans had already made significant contributions to the economy, and although they weren't completely assimilated, they still had German worship services, as Carol said, German businesses in Nashville. There were a lot of German folks here, and I was just going back to the history. Some of the push factors in Germany had to do with the loss of agricultural land. Some of it had to do with what's called the revolutions of 1848. I don't know whether you know much about that. Those were spontaneous uprisings in a number of countries in Europe where people were demonstrating for constitutional government. And Germany, as you may recall from European history, was slow to unify. I mean, France had been unified since the 14th century, and Germany was 37 principalities, many of which were ruled by complete autocrats. And so in 1848, there were this really across Europe, these popular uprisings. They were actually armies that had fought against the official armies, or then Prussia would send in its army to suppress the revolt in these smaller countries and principalities. So there was actually, that caused a lot of German immigration. Don't know how much that connected to Nashville, but as you may know, the cities in America, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, really the upper Midwest had greater German migration than Nashville. Many of them, Pittsburgh, had a number of German newspapers. I think Cincinnati had 3 German newspapers on the eve of World War I. Nashville, if you've read, and I just know this from having read the historic marker down in front of the Catholic Church in Germantown. The sermons were in German until World War I. I think those folks came mostly, and this is, Carol will have to correct me on this or modify this, were mostly Catholics from the Rhineland, or many of them. The Baltz and Neuhoff families, Baltz and Neuhoff families in Nashville, still prominent, own meatpacking plants up there. And in Germany, Bavaria is largely Catholic, but so is large parts of the Rhineland around Cologne and are Catholic as well. And my recollection is that those immigrants were from the Catholics from the Rhineland. A story I'll share from my experience as German honorary consul. Early in my tenure, which began in 2004, I received a call, and this has a Nashville connection. I'm dying to get one of these able professional historians to look into. And they asked me whether I had the records for the North German Confederation consulate in Nashville from 1870. And I said, no, I did not happen to have those. And they asked me where they might be. And I said, well, the Atlanta consulate, which is the official consulate region we're in, didn't open until 1905. So if there's such records, then they must be back in Germany, probably in the Federal Archives in Berlin. And it got me to thinking, though, that if indeed there were a consular office of this precursor to the modern German state, 1867 to 1871, there was this confederation that Bismarck was behind before he got behind the first German Empire, the first Deutsches Reich. If they had a consulate in Nashville, why did they? And the reason they would have done that is because any consulate is there to look after the private interest of its citizens. And so Nashville must have had enough of a thriving German community at that time to warrant having a consular official here. So that's yet to be researched by someone who knows more about it than I do. But I thought that would be a cool topic if somebody who's a professor or someone wanted to assign that to a grad student for a master's thesis or something. Anyway, appreciate everybody being here, and that's it for my part.
I just have a couple minor things to add, just to give a little bit more clarification. At the time that we were discussing in the years leading up to World War I, just like most communities, local communities were centered around church and your religious affiliation. So there will be discrepancies between the experiences of Jewish Germans as well as German Catholics, Christians, whatever their leniencies for the religion goes, just because they did experience things very differently. I'm not sure if Jean touched on this, but the Jewish community was not considered full members of the German community, even if they had hailed from Germany, just simply because they didn't have citizenship rights in Germany at the time. So there was a discrepancy as far as internal xenophobia towards people from their own country, just simply because of their religious breakdown. Outside of that, we did see while Germans were moving into Nashville, building up their businesses, creating communities, you had German businesses hiring from within their own communities. So you had them helping each other out to provide this building of an entire community, not just specific families. So the Jewish businesses would hire amongst the originally other German Jews, and then after that it began to deviate into other Jewish sections of other immigrant groups that came to Nashville later on. The same can be said about German Catholic organizations and businesses because, again, they wanted to help support their own local community of people that shared their experiences from the migration all the way to raising families in a new country and trying to develop into this holistic idea of what it was to be a migrant in a new location. So there was a lot of community building within their own purviews, but also trying to expand it to include other people. So while they would tend to hire from within their own communities, they did try to ingratiate themselves to Nashville at large by either, expanding into advertisements, across the board, as well as just creating local organizations as well that weren't just limited to Germans or German Americans. They had them open for everybody following certain philosophies in order to build that connection with the broader neighborhoods that they were thriving in.
I think that one of the things that really happened after the Civil War, too, that was really beneficial to the first smatterings of cross-cultural exchanges, and also eventually a little bit of interracial dialogue here, were that this Nashville experienced this proliferation after the Civil War in the 1880s and 90s of women's organizations, voluntary organizations of women, and they fell into about 3 different categories, I suppose. I've never really quite thought about this just exactly like this, but first of all, many of them were church-related, and they were what you and I would call take care of the sick and the poor, the widows and the orphans. And these groups had been around before the Civil War, but they really became much more organized and crossed denominations. They began crossing denominations. But for the Protestant women to interact with the Catholic women and the Jewish women, that was a little bit of a reach. And that you see the Protestant women and the Catholic women and the Jewish women, really, the thing that really brought them together the most was the right to vote, the suffrage movement here in Tennessee. Now, an organization that ended up being rather divisive was the largest of all the women's groups in the United States, including the suffrage women, and that was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They had the benefit of powerful and effective leaders, Frances Willard and Selena Holman, a Fayetteville member of the Disciples of Christ congregation here in Tennessee. These women were powerhouses, and of course they hit up against a wall among the Catholic community. And this trickled to some degree to the Jewish community, but the German Catholics really seemed to receive the most criticism by the ladies of the WCTU, who wanted to close all the saloons. They wanted to put all of the beer gardens and places that sold beer and alcohol out of business here. But you see these women's study groups too coming along, and for example, the Jewish community had the magazine circle, and we had the Query Club and the Review Club among the Protestant women here, and they learn about the world. And as they learn more, expanding their minds, I think they became open to some new ideas. But there were these walls that the Protestant women and the Catholic women and the Jewish women, they just did not mingle beyond those boundaries. And the marvelous thing about the suffrage movement, some of you may have actually known a very dear woman, Elizabeth Jacobs, who was a longstanding member of the Jewish community, and her mother, Mrs. Lowenheim, became very interested in women having the right to vote. And so her mother joined the Suffrage Association, and she associated with the likes of Anne Dallas Dudley, a Protestant, and Catherine Kenny, an Irish Catholic. And here we have these women becoming broad-minded enough to actually invite an African-American woman, Frankie Pierce, to a big suffrage meeting that they were having in early 1920, and it was quite a remarkable thing to see that happen. And so I wanted to put in a little bit of a plug for women's history here while we're talking about all of this. But another person, especially the fact that some of the Jewish men who came were doctors, that also really, I think, sort of began cracking open the doors a little bit. Gustavus Schiff was a doctor here, and he had come from Memphis right on the eve of the Civil War, 1859. He worked as an Army doctor here in Nashville in the hospitals of the Union Army after the city of Nashville fell to the Union. He continued his practice here during the cholera epidemic in 1873, when many doctors would not treat these patients who had cholera, and even one doctor in town just flatly insisted that it wasn't transmitted by germs, it was transmitted by your diet. Dr. Schiff continued treating patients. Now, after that was all over, he left here in 1879 and went to Texas, and I don't think he has any descendants here. But there were these little tiny openings within these walls that existed.
Well, I would like, first of all, to intone what Mr. Berry said about the 1848 revolution. That sparked a number of German Jews coming here to this country. And many of you will probably recognize the name Oakes, as in New York Times. The father and mother of the men who actually founded continued and kept it going, the New York Times, met here in Nashville. And they married. And no two people were ever more poorly mismatched. It was a totally dysfunctional marriage. They had a half a dozen children, and the father was more inclined to study and read. He had a more orthodox kind of Jewish background, and the mother was a flaming liberal, and they could not really support the children. And they moved from here to Knoxville and then to Chattanooga, and it was in Chattanooga where their son began working on the local newspaper, which became bankrupt. He bought it, and then he made it a success, and then he went to New York. And he did the same sort of thing with the New York Times, which was floundering at that point, and he made it into a big success. So the 1848 revolution did spark some German Jews coming here. And a point that Amy made that I think is very, very important regarding the Jewish community. Initially, they were basically German-speaking, the largest majority of them. But by the time you get to the second generation, you have a wide range of nationalities in Nashville. Along with the nationalities went the differences in how they observed Jewish religion. The German Jews were very prosperous, and they built the Vine Street Temple. Have any of you seen pictures of the Vine Street Temple with its imposing 9 Byzantine-type towers? What it would be for Nashville if that building were still there, rather than the parking lot entrance to this building. Right. And so you found the German Jews who were kind of uppity about the Polish Jews and basically the Hungarian Jews having their own societies, like the Standard Club, which was their answer to the Belmead Country Club. Then you had the Poles inaugurating their more or less conservative form of Judaism. The big difference being that men were allowed to sit with women, or vice versa, the women were allowed to sit with men. And there was a group of Orthodox who didn't like that, and so they formed their own synagogue. And that was on Fifth Avenue, where, again, there is a parking lot next to the Ryman. They bought a house, and then they made it in 1920 into a brick building, and they were downtown as the Fifth Avenue Synagogue before they moved out to West End right after the war. So you had a tremendous diversity in the Jewish community, but I would say they were Jews first because they had to take care of each other. They didn't have any poverty that was not addressed. Orphans were taken care of. It was really a more or less self-sufficient community.
All right, the next question. How was Germany depicted in the United States at the outbreak of World War I?
I think that the depictions really started fairly early, as soon as the war actually began in late 1914, because we had some folks here in the United States that, number one, did not like our sitting president, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had named as his Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who was known to be a pacifist and opposed to any U.S. intervention in wars, and Woodrow Wilson had already taken American troops down to the New Mexico-Texas Mexican border and actually invaded Mexico in 1913, and so we have troops fighting down in Mexico, American troops, but we have some people who just feel that Woodrow Wilson needs to get us into the war in Europe, that we need to be over there saving the Allies against the Germans, and so I think this was really very noticeable in places like Milwaukee, where there was a more homogeneous, defined German community than there was here in Nashville. But you do begin to see this coming up. And I mentioned that Luke Lee had taken over this newspaper, that American, and so his newspaper, the Tennessean and American, they generally made their positions, and this is not really reflective of Luke Lee exactly, as just this was the golden age of newspaper journalism from about, 1900 to 1975. We had the golden age. Whatever the afternoon paper, the Banner, was for, the Tennessean was against, and whatever the Tennessean was for, the Banner was against. And philosophically, you look at some of these things, and the papers were paired with the wrong candidates, but nonetheless. So for example, Luke Lee became very interested in the cause of prohibition and a supporter of Senator Edward Carmack. Well, we have the colonel, he will become the colonel after World War one gets going. Colonel Lee at his newspaper, and you've got Major Stallman running his newspaper. I'm sure there's something to be interpreted from those titles. But nonetheless, Luke Lee was against alcohol and prohibition. He supported prohibition. Dry it up. He was a big spokesman for the dries. Well, Major Stallman, who supported the ideas of two big city mayors, Nashville's Hillary House and Memphis's Edward Crump, he said it should be by local option, that the state should not declare every county in Tennessee dry. And after Senator Carmack was assassinated on the streets of Nashville, the legislature did make Tennessee completely dry 9 years before national prohibition. So here you've got these newspapers debating everything, and with these people that I would call them almost war hawks, chief of which the loudest voice was Theodore Roosevelt. And we had some other folks in this. They called it the preparedness movement. It wasn't war hawks, but it was the preparedness movement. So with the sinking of the Lusitania, the preparedness movement really gets ratcheted up, and we have major parades in Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga, and Major Stallman is saying we need to stay out of this. We do not need to escalate this notion that it's inevitable that the United States must go into this war. And so, as you see, when April 1917 finally comes along, even when the Germans decided they were going to resume submarine warfare and announced that in early February, Major Stallman is saying, we do not need to go to war. William Jennings Bryan was calling for a national referendum of all the people before we went to war. And so Major Stallman said, we need a referendum, and of course Luke Lee took the opposite position.
Okay, there's a point that I think really needs to be made right now, and that is that we've talked about Germans and German Jews coming to Nashville from 1850 on. By the time you get to World War I, you're talking about second and possibly even third generation. So you've got much more of a divorce from the fatherland. You have young people who are thinking American, speaking English, and they're neutral. Like the rest, basically the rest of the country was at that time about going to war. So I think the fact that we're several generations down the line plays into the way we're looking at all of this. And the Lusitania, of course, was what changed most people's mind. I will say that I was looking through some older journals put out by the Young Men's Hebrew Association this morning, and they were already talking about the conditions under which Jews were living in Poland and in Russia in particular. And they were raising money throughout the country. And in one evening, they raised $45,000 in 1916 here in Nashville. So you had a lot of concern about what was happening over there, but I still think you had a hesitation about going into war until things became irreversible.
And that brings up another thought, that there were two Nashville sisters who were in Paris when World War I began, and the Germans came from Belgium and towards Paris into France, and they actually went out and saw a Red Cross hospital in action before they came back to Nashville in the fall of 1914. And so they were members. One was a member of the Review Club, and one was a member of the Query Club for unmarried women, and the Review Club, sort of the graduate club for married women. But they were study clubs. And so one of the things they did, and several women's groups followed, was they started adopting, so to speak, French orphans, and they would raise money for these French orphans and send money and presents over to these French orphans. And so that was a way that some of these women got involved, trying to send care packages over to the Allies as the war progressed.
The magazine circle, which was basically a book club, was very involved in that. They adopted 7 orphans.
Yeah.
And I presume they were not Jewish. I don't know.
One thing, Roosevelt at this time came out with the statement that you couldn't be a hyphenated American. Even many of the German Americans, of course, were American citizens by that time. But he said, in wartime, you must be loyal to one or the other. So no lesser a personage than H.L. Mencken actually espoused the German cause in his newspaper. And remember, unlike World War II, there were no, if you will, wicked totalitarian ideologies on either side. All the participants except France were monarchies, although in varying stages of liberalizing that situation. But Germany was truly the aggressor in the war. You remember there was a great sympathy for Belgium, little Belgium. And so early on, the sympathies were against Germany. The Justice Department prepared a list of all German aliens, about 480,000, and 4,000 of whom were imprisoned on charges of spying or endorsing the German war effort. German citizens were often asked to buy war bonds to prove their loyalty, and thus could financially avoid being placed in prison. I don't know how many of those cases were prosecuted successfully, if any, but nothing like good old wartime hysteria. Well,
and speaking of wartime hysteria, over at the Tennessean, publisher Luke Lee, at least this is in Ralph McGill, a journalist who got his start at the Banner. He wrote this in his memoir. I've not been able to find a line in the Tennessean saying this one way or the other, but according to Ralph McGill's memoir, about being a Southerner, among other things, he said that Luke Lee attempted to get Major Stallman declared an enemy alien and get him rounded up and put in prison. Wow. Or exiled, send him out. When you think about that, Stallman had been here he was very elderly at this point, and he had been here since the 1860s, and yet his children and grandchildren, he was well established in the community, and he died, I guess, about 1930, Stallman did, but I can't imagine the newspaper editors trying to get Mr. Stallman, Major Stallman, arrested.
Just a couple other tidbits to add. Before we even entered the war, as they have mentioned already, there was already groups forming, especially on the side of the women, but also we do see businessmen forming groups as well at the time, gathering money to send abroad to help the Allied nations, our unofficial allies, even though we were considered neutral at the time. But you also had women's groups throughout Nashville forming various Red Cross branches and local defense leagues that would actually drill at nighttime to keep sure Nashville was prepared in the case of enemy invasion, whether it be from aliens, German aliens rising up to take over the city, or if eventually the U.S. entered the war and the war came home. So you had a lot of effort even before we joined the war that people were preparing because they knew it was only a matter of time before we were drug in. And so you have a lot of these, but there was also efforts to help wounded soldiers abroad even before we had any in the military or serving over there. So you had women's groups raising money for blind soldiers as a result of attacks in the battlefield, but they were also trying to create organizations that would look after the betterment of soldiers abroad. That way, when we were organized into the war effort, it would be easier to organize those same agencies for our men at home, a lot of which hadn't existed prior to that. So the desire to make sure wounded men had jobs when they returned home from the front lines, that was something that they really pushed even before we joined the war effort. And so we actually brought in veterans serving, fighting for France as well as Britain, to bring them in to act partial as patriotic, get us behind the Allied war movement, but also to show that people need to start thinking about after the war and taking care of each other throughout and after. Mentioning back on the Stallman point, I read multiple articles about that as well, and it was quite interesting going back to the various points of view with the Tennessean, and this is a couple different ones, but to go back, you can see there's two different articles. One's from the Nashville, actually these ones are both from Nashville Banner, I'm sorry. Okay. We've got two articles. One's from the Banner, and the other one is from the Tennessean. And even though these are portraying different events, you can see that their ideas on how to address the situation differ greatly. The Tennessean was very anti-Germany from the very beginning of the war. The Nashville Banner took a much more neutral tone, at least until we had entered the war and had been in the war for a few months. Even after declaring war, the Nashville Banner tended to try and remain a little bit more neutral in tone, just because they had such a concern about going against the ideas of the Tennessean, but as well as just views on the society at large. So, but at the time, the United States was being impacted with ideas of, even before we entered the war, we had to get rid of all German traces, whether it be the language, heritage ideas, anything that portrayed the idea of a proud German many people wanted to give it the boot. So we've got two articles up here. Neither one took place in Nashville, but these are articles that were published in the Nashville papers to give the sense that all of this stuff is happening throughout the country. Everybody needs to be on board. So it was one of those where you have other cities making drastic moves to rid themselves of all German heritage. That way it feeds this idea of everyone needs to do it together. And at the same time, there was a huge movement for what they called the American First Movement, which was a drive to naturalize all immigrants, no matter if they were German or Irish or what have you. They were pushing for this whole idea of everyone needing to become a proud American on paper, not just in voice. And so you had multiple people, and at that time the naturalization laws only required the male leader of the family to go through the process. But at the same time, because of the drive to Americanize everyone, they actually started calling out young women, single women, to naturalize themselves without waiting for their father to do it or for their husband. So, or soon-to-be husband. But that did cause quite a bit of animosity, as you might think, just because initially when we declared war, there was plenty of statements made by the federal government that this naturalization process would be open and very fast-paced for enemy aliens or aliens from the countries that we were at war with. But what soon came to pass was the people that were signing up for naturalization rights, it became a quick stop for the government to get your information to watch you more closely. And so it actually led to a lot of people being rounded up and put into internment camps, concentration camps, and actually being held at naturalization stations throughout the duration of the war. So there was quite an impact as far as what the country was calling for, and even when you had these people following up and doing exactly what they were told, it tended to impact them negatively at the same time, unless you were dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's to make sure that you weren't bothering anybody in the federal government.
And, you know, you've got to also keep in mind that as American laborers in the late 19th century had attempted to unionize, the industrialists, who were very much against unions because it would affect their profit ratio in production, and they saw the right of contract. When you take a job at 50 cents an hour, you voluntarily signed a contract to do that. So anything you don't like really before the war, by 1900, you just said, oh, they're socialists. Now, those of us who are of a certain age remember that anything you didn't like in the 50s, communist. Well, that became communist pretty quickly when the Russian Revolution took place during World War I, and the country was really, as Amy said, became paranoid about aliens. And so with the war over, with the armistice signed, we start rounding up our Attorney General Palmer had these raids known as the Palmer raids that were just notoriously rounding up anybody that might be socialist or communist. And of course, the people who bore the brunt of this were Germans, Eastern Europeans, and Russians, no matter how long they had been Americans. And as Amy mentioned, the naturalization laws were pretty. If you could get off the boat at Ellis Island, you were free after you got through the immigration officials there. But there wasn't really much to becoming a citizen. And then in the 20s, we have this huge backlash. And the immigration restrictions began in the 1920s as a result of this ratcheting up of paranoia during the years preceding the first Immigration Restriction Act.
I have been working on a very obscure part of Jewish history, and that involves the Industrial Removal Office. It was founded in New York by German Jews who were concerned that the Eastern Europeans that had come in following the pogroms in 1880 were giving a very bad name to Jews everywhere. So they came up with an idea of removing, hence the name Industrial Removal Office, removing these Jews to communities in the United States where they would be absorbed and maybe taught a new skill, because many of them had been in shtetls in Eastern Europe and really didn't have skills because they were studying to be rabbis in yeshivas. So there was a group of about 200 that came here to Nashville. There were very few that really liked it or stayed. They much preferred to go back and be culturally at home with fellow Eastern Europeans. But one person who stayed was Simon Gertner. And you've all heard of the Gertner Real Estate Company. And there were others who were mainly shoemakers and so forth, but most did not stay. And the reason I bring that up is to intone the idea that the xenophobia of that period was huge, absolutely huge. And it resulted in the 1924 Reed-Johnson Act that really cut down not only Eastern Europeans and so forth, but Jews. I mean, specifically Jews. And I have to say, that carried over into the 30s. Many more visas could have been granted to German Jews. They weren't. And anyway, that's another topic, and so I'll let that one go.
Just let me pull this off because I'm not sure if everybody can read this article. This is one of the articles I found while doing my research, and it kind of shows how intense even here life was for Germans. The headline reads, "Nashville boy held as a spy." James Morrissey, a Nashville youth, has written relatives here of his arrest and detention in Canada as a German spy. Young Morrissey explains that he had gone across the river at Detroit and while there was picked up by the authorities and lodged in an English camp. He was detained there 3 days, he says, and it was with some difficulty that he finally succeeded in establishing his identity and securing his release. Young Morrissey is well known in the city. He left here only recently and went to Detroit to accept employment. His parents live on Ackland Avenue in Waverly Place. So just to give you an idea, just simply existing as a German or German American did not give you any, just because you considered yourself loyal to the country didn't mean the country saw you the same way. And so there was a lot of suspicion that led a lot of these individuals to being unjustly interned. There was also an incident at Oglethorpe down in Chattanooga where a local had addressed Guten Morgen to one of the prisoners that he saw at the fort. He was immediately arrested and interrogated for 3 hours simply by addressing the gentleman in German, because it was assumed that if he spoke German, he must be aligned with the German prisoners. And so the fact that he was addressing them, they couldn't trust that persona, and so he was interrogated for several hours until they reached the conclusion, okay, this guy isn't somebody that we need to be concerned with anymore. But it was that kind of heightened hysteria that meant that even using your mother tongue or your ancestral tongue could get you in a very precarious position just simply because of the situation the world was in at the time.
Henry Neuhoff had come to Nashville from, I think, from St. Louis, and he was German, and he had started a packing business up actually on College Street near the Cumberland River on North Nashville, Germantown area. And he had, in the beginning, at least until about 1880, if you wanted meat, the person who was the butcher generally, literally, had cows in the backyard. There wasn't a big farm or until refrigerated cars came along, I suppose, railroad cars. So the Neuhoff's packing business flourished. And the Neuhoffs had a large family of children, so they bought a big farm on White Bridge Road, and not White Bridge Road, in the Whites Creek area, the bend of the Cumberland River known as Whites Creek, and moved up there. And Nashville began observing gasless Sundays, so all of the Germans were extra careful to not drive their cars on Sunday at all, and the Neuhoffs came into town in a horse and wagon, which was definitely below their station in life, so to speak, because they were well-to-do citizens, but they didn't want to do anything to attract attention to themselves. Well, imagine the terror that Henry Neuhoff felt when it was discovered there was some glass in some of the sausage produced at the Neuhoff plant. And he was, I can imagine, only mortified about this. Apparently, in the days before plastic bottles, they had some spices in something that was glass that broke, and the man doing the making thought he had gotten all the pieces of glass out, and some customers found glass in their sausage. And this could have turned into a true situation of actual violence here in Nashville, but I think in part to Major Stallman's determination that this was going to be treated fairly and nobody was really hurt, and they didn't prosecute Huff or his worker for this. It showed that you could accept apologies to some degree.
Although it is funny you mentioned that, because until Stallman made those remarks, the Tennessean was pushing the idea that it was done intentionally as an attempt to corrupt Nashville and break down our. For some reason, it was related to a spy network ring, just because it was a way to harm Americans.
And the Tennessean was very much saying he must be connected to a group of spies. And of course, Luke Lee's already re-enlisted. He's over in Germany doing who knows what, capturing the Kaiser among other things, or trying to at least. But the Tennessean was very concerned about this until he made the apology, and it was accepted in good faith.
All right. What were the various opinions, and I know we've already touched on this a little bit, what were the various opinions from Germans and German Americans towards the World War while the United States was neutral, and then what was it like after we joined?
Well, I think we have touched on that a little bit. The German communities were watching and waiting, but as they heard what was going on in Milwaukee and in some of the Midwestern and Northern states, they proceeded with great caution because they wanted to be known as Americans, not hyphenated Americans, and yet they also wanted us to stay out of this war. So they are very, very cautious of their identity and want their children to not speak German to each other, even at school when the children are going to school. And they do everything they can to try to make it clear that they are Americans, and yet they are walking a tightrope because they want to hold on to their German culture at home.
I would intone the same thing. I think that the German Jews in Nashville wanted to remain neutral, but wanted to see things get better in Germany, and there wasn't much they could do at all. This was the situation. Also, another factor, many of them still had relatives in Germany, and you know from your understanding of the Holocaust that many of the Jews who themselves were exterminated during the 30s and 40s had been valiant soldiers in World War I in Germany. And so they too did what Jews have done and what Germans have done. They've gone with with the country that they were involved with. Amy, I want to ask you a question now, and I'm putting you on the spot because I've never looked into this. Was there much propaganda by the Germans here in this area?
Most of the propaganda I noticed reading through was either done as editorials, which pretty much persecuted German Americans, trying to get them to prove their undying loyalty even beyond what other people were expected. But it was also a matter of just how slanted articles were in the newspaper. They would put spy plots and all of these terror threats that the Germans were being blamed for on the front page as well as the first couple of pages. Whenever the Tennessean would find out, okay, these plots were false, they've been found out, there's no longer a threat here, those would always be placed very, very strategically, either on the last page in a 3-second blurb, or they would be hidden next to articles that still pejoritized the Germans and the war effort. So it was very conspicuously done. I did also notice that no one's ethnicity or no one's heritage was acknowledged if they did anything good in Nashville. You had all kinds of Germans in the area signing up for the war before the draft even took place. You had them joining various units or creating auxiliary groups to support the war effort. no mention was given to these people's heritage, but in the very few instances that they went against the United States to support Germany or to support, neutrality on the United States, they called their ancestry out every time to show that this is why they think that way. So it was one of those things where it's like they never wanted to highlight German Americans doing good things unless it was an overarching, the Catholics pledge loyalty to Wilson, the Methodists pledge loyalty to Wilson, and they'll go in very minutely by saying it's this community group that's composed of these German Americans in this city. But by and large, especially locally, if a German did something proactive for the war effort in a patriotic manner, they were just allowed to be described as just themselves and their families mentioned, but they would not relate to their ancestry unless it was a negative article.
Was there any pro-German propaganda?
Not in the newspapers. There was a couple of letters to the editor that were written that supports Germany, but those were done before the United States entered. As soon as the United States entered the war, there was a complete censorship on speaking out against President Wilson, against the war effort, and even to the point where suffragists had been placed in jail simply by having a banner that claimed President Wilson was labeled Kaiser Wilson. They tore down the banner and put the women in jail because even the idea of Kaiser Wilson was considered obstructionist to the government.
I have the impression that nationwide that the trend was much more the other way, and there were people changing family names from Müller to Miller, Schmidt to Smith. There's an example of a place name change where there's Berlin, Michigan, renamed itself Marne after the Battle of the Marne, Michigan. Orchestras that stopped playing Wagner, which there might be perfectly good musical reasons not to do that either. But Cincinnati removed all the German books from their library. So I think in general there was the German Americans who were here were eager to prove their loyalty to America.
Now, I will say, going back to the name changes, I noticed that it really depends on the area they grew up in or that they settled in. My own last name, Wanamaker, is in the traditional spelling, but because my family settled in a German Catholic town, they never saw the need to Americanize their name in World War I because they didn't have the same context of other groups putting that pressure on them. But at the same time, the entire town got rid of the German language, any
street names.
Heritage ties. The only street name that remained in our town was Bredeijk, and that was because Father Otto Bredeijk is who led the German Catholics to settle the town. That was the only road name that was allowed to stay the same. But other than that, I do completely agree. You saw a massive shift in German Americans trying to prove themselves as worthy Americans, either to release the tensions on themselves and on their family, but also because it was a very difficult time for everyone where men were expected to be unwaveringly patriotic and to join the war effort to a point where even men who tried to dodge the draft or not go for their examinations after being drafted were brought up on charges and put into jail simply because with World War I, there was no idea of trying to remain neutral because of your own religious beliefs. So there was that moral compass was no longer accepted as a reason to want out of the war, which had been allowed for every war up until that point. You could use, I forget the exact term, it's moral objection.
Right.
But
conscientious objector.
Conscientious objector, thank you. But as a result of that, you had Mennonites being attacked and Quakers and anybody of these that were considered too German because of their heritage, but also because they were conscientious objectors. They could not be trusted, even if it was just that was their stance since the beginning of the religion.
There is a very fine book about that, very subject, called The Long Way Home. And can you help me with the author's name?
I don't know the author's
but
name.
It's Laskin. He was looking to, he was writing about his Jewish heritage. It's a fascinating book, but this one is about all sorts of German communities that were very much pacifist. And the name of the book is The Long Way Home, and it is really powerful when you see how badly those people, they were put in U.S. military camps. And I mean, they were out in the middle of Montana somewhere, or one of the Dakotas maybe, where they weren't bothering anybody. And yet all the men were put essentially in cages, and many of them died under torture for that during World War I.
All right. So we discussed a little bit more. I'm wanting to turn over the PowerPoint presentation to you, Jean, because I know the next few slides are going to be yours.
Maybe you better do it.
Yeah.
Okay, because I may mess up. The question basically is, what were some of the patriotic steps the German community made in response to the war, either by joining the military or supporting the war effort from the home front? And as far as the German Jews in Nashville were concerned, 138 young men volunteered for World War I. 4 did not come back. 2 were killed in combat, and 2 died in non-combat or accident-related situations. 1 had pneumonia. But I wanted to talk about Lee Leventhal. He probably was the most outstanding German Jew in Nashville, and outstanding also included his physical presence. He was over 6 feet, and I'm sure you've encountered his name. He was always asked to be on boards, and one of the funny things is when the YMCA started its law school, even though the YMCA did not allow Jews to join, they wanted Lee Leventhal on their board because he lent such stature, and I mean that 2 ways, to the board. Anyway, during the war, he was the chair of the United War Work Committee in Nashville. Now this is 1917-18. He raised $2 million here for the war effort. He also worked raising money for the Red Cross, and after the war, he applied those financial skills for fundraising to forming the community chest, which I'm sure some of you remember here in Nashville, because it became United Givers Fund later on. So Lee Leventhal was really quite a dynamic force in the Nashville community. I also have to give you a little aside story. If you look at the Customs House across from Hume Fogg High School, you will notice that there's one wing on the right side of the building. That wing was added during World War I by Joseph Lightman. Joseph Lightman had come from Hungary. He was here in Nashville for probably 40 years or so at the time. He undertook to build that. And guess what? The government couldn't pay him. He didn't ask for any money at all. He did build the Belcourt Theater, which was the Hillsborough Theater initially. And if you want to see another place that he built, when you drive by Valentino's on West End, look directly across the street at the Stone Home, which is now a legal office building. You probably know who is in that building. And it's a beautiful piece of stonework. So Joseph Lightman never got paid. He donated his services for building the Customs House. Next one is Aaron Weiser. Aaron Weiser was an aviator, and he really wanted to be in the initial Army Air Force. I mean, that was a big deal. And he did it, and he did it well. And after the war, he wanted to be a rabbi after what he saw. And he did go to rabbinical school, but he didn't actually complete it. And this was William Kirshner. His great-granddaughter, Merrill Kirshner Kraft, may be known to some of you. I'm sure you know her because you've spoken for her. He was a cook. He was just a private. But I want you to notice his dog tag. Those of us who have seen World War II dog tags know that they were a totally different shape. And with the German Jews, or with the Jews in general, the World War II tags had an H on it, obviously for Hebrew. This did not, but William Kirshner was in the war and acquitted himself very, very well, but he was a cook. And that was my father-in-law, Carl Kleeman. He was in World War I in France, and donated what he brought back, which were mainly pictures. They were commercial pictures of French things. I donated them to TSLA. And now comes some women. I want to tell you the women here, and Carol has made numerous references to what the women did here in Nashville. They raised money, they volunteered for the Red Cross, they sold bonds and war-saving stamps, they canned, they pickled, they knitted, they collected linens, they gardened. And one of the very big things that particularly the Nashville Council of Jewish Women, the NCJW, did, they Americanized foreign-born Jews that came to Nashville. They had English classes, and a lot of these people went to school to learn new trades, women too, in the building downtown. I can't think of the name.
The Bertha Fensterwald Center?
No, it was the Bertha Fensterwald Center.
Yeah, Watkins College.
Watkins, I just flew out of my mind. They went there, some of the men learned such things as radio announcing and that sort of thing, and the women learned skills. It was amazing the way they all came together to really support the war effort here in town. And this is Jenny Lasky. She sold thrift stamps and was the chair of the Women's Division of the Jewish Welfare. And Letty Lusky sold Liberty loan bonds and chaired that committee raising money for hospitals. And some of you remember, the next one, the Mills bookstores. How many of you remember that, when we had real bookstores here in town? Not that we don't have Parnassus, but that's just by the grace of a few women who put that together. But she was very involved in raising money and, again, selling bonds and so forth. All of this is in a huge compendium about World War I, rather. The Davidson County Women in the World War. I know you all know that book for sure. It's really interesting to look at that book. And then, Lizzie. Lizzie was the force behind the magazine circle that both Carol and I have brought up. That was a book club, but they were much more than a book club. Lizzie Bloomstein lived on 5th Avenue South, and I'm afraid that building is about to come down now. Have you followed that?
I have heard that it was.
Yes, I have heard that it's coming down. That building was built before the Civil War by the man who brought together the first minyan, the first service for Jews here in Nashville in 1848. Isaac Garretson was his name. He built that home, and it passed to a rabbi, the first rabbi here in Nashville, and then it passed to another Jewish family, and then the Bloomsteins with their 10 children took it over. And then it still stayed in Jewish hands. 200 plus years in Jewish hands. And most recently, obviously in the last several decades, it's been in an area of town that's been going downhill. And so not much was done until most recently a real estate young woman bought the building and restored it. But those of you who have gone along Fifth Avenue South know that that area is just becoming more and more condominium-oriented and apartments and so forth, like what is happening in all of Nashville. And I'm afraid that building, which the young real estate executive sold, is probably going to come down. But Lizzie Bloomstein lived in that building. She never married. She was the first female professor at what became Peabody. And she became ultimately the librarian there. And she had this magazine group of women that got together and wrote letters and helped disabled veterans from World War I, and just really made quite an impact on particularly Jewish soldiers that returned. And I'd also like to say that after World War I was over, the name Morris Frank might be familiar to you. He was blind. He had 2 accidents when he was a child. One was on a horse, another was he got punched in his eye. And so he was totally blind. And he was always dependent on his parents to take him for a haircut or do whatever. And he began to hear about, after World War I, how Germans and the Swiss were developing the concept of seeing eye dogs. And he went to Germany alone and to Switzerland, and he got a loan to start a dog school here in Nashville. And that dog school was in the Banner office, and where Printers Alley is. That's why they call it Printers Alley, because the newspapers were, of course, printed there. And Nashville was particularly a welcoming spot for dogs, because dogs were allowed in restaurants, dogs were allowed on streetcars, dogs were allowed all over the city. So it became a good training spot, but with one problem, and that was that the dogs found it too hot. So they moved to New Jersey. But Morris Frank founded the first seeing dog eye school in the United States here as a result of World War I. Oh, do I have another? Oh, that was just a picture I saw they were dancing in the streets when the troops came home. I've read memoirs about going to that celebration and how exciting it was. And then, of course, it was quickly followed by the Spanish flu and other problems of that era. But anyway, I just thought that picture just captures how joyous things were in the community when it was all over.
And this brings us back to the original map of the original German town. Might seem silly now, but the reason how it got its name was that's where all of the German community originally started to settle down. It did kind of make transitions as the years went on, from my understanding, just from where they could afford land originally to where they were able to set up their own churches, and obviously churches and factories and businesses kind of created communities around them. I do know it was a point of contention. The main German Catholic church at the time was the Church of the Assumption over on Monroe and 7th Avenue. They had a thriving community, still conducted their Mass every Sunday in German, but in the years, I'm not exactly sure when Worth & Bag Company set up shop in that district.
It was right around the turn of the century.
At the same time, Jews started moving into the area to be close to the Worth Bag Company, and a lot of the Catholics, speaking to the anti-Semitism, decided to leave their own neighborhood that they had been thriving in for decades because of this new unknown element that they weren't comfortable with. And so you had a lot of German Catholics moving to St. Anne's Parish, and also creating other various churches that were more reformed and a little bit more lax on the guidelines, that were somewhere between Catholicism and Protestant. It was a very peculiar situation. But locally, you did have the backlash as far as the Church of the Assumption quit doing their German language services, as well as other churches throughout the community that did provide German language. Schools were banned from having the German language taught. Instead, they replaced it with free French lessons that anyone in the community could take from from a wide range of options, and they were given for free. And it was kind of an interesting concept. You had to do away with one international language. What was the most logical one to change it to? Well, we were sending all of our men, and a lot of the auxiliary work was all going to France, because that's where the battle was primarily located. And so the response was, let's teach everyone French. They'll have a better go of it during the war, and after the war, we know we're going to be there for a little bit longer to help rebuild. So it's kind of interesting how the German language was basically taken out of public spaces and replaced by French.
German was banned in metro schools for 11 years, from 1919 into the 30s. So it still had an effect on enrollment when I came to Nashville. I had a degree in German, and I was hoping to get a teaching position in German. Now, there were still some youngsters who wanted to be doctors, so there was reason to have it and to tolerate smaller classes. But I learned very quickly, as opposed to the North, where there were just more Germans, that here in the South, in a German teaching capacity, enrollment was existence. And so I always had to work at enrollment. And I actually wrote a dissertation on why students in Tennessee chose French or Spanish or Latin over German. And one of the strong reasons I found was all of what was still there in memory of World War I. And then I also found the portrayal of Germans in television programs like Hogan's Heroes and so forth. They were always kind of silly and overweight and all that. They weren't really people you wanted to emulate. So it put me in a position, as I was telling Mr. Berry this morning, of having to find some reason to justify my existence, and I developed an exchange program. And that was extremely successful in the metro schools. I did it for 20 years, and the program continues even after I retired 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it's no longer in the public schools. It's with MBA and Harpeth Hall. And they are in Germany right now on their portion. The program worked with German group coming in the spring and going to school on a daily basis and participating in a program that introduced them to American life and Nashville life. And then the American student would go and stay, hopefully with the same family. In most cases, that did work out. And they would go to German school and also get introduced to things in the German life. And so it was an extremely successful program. As I said earlier to Mr. Berry, I'd hate to be doing that now because young people want to go to exotic places. They want to go to Thailand. They want to go to Africa and so forth. But it worked for me to keep my existence going. However, German is almost not taught in metro schools now. I think only at the two magnet schools. So.
And I do think it warrants saying that that is not something that's just limited to Nashville. That is a major situation throughout the United States. My own school growing up, I went to a German Catholic high school, and we had no German language in our school. Claims was budget. But we had a sister school in Germany that we would receive students from every year. And it was actually from one of the original towns that the people left to form my hometown. But what was interesting was we would bring these people here, let them stay for anywhere from 6 months to a year. They would not be given any opportunities to speak German or to help anyone in the community to speak German because the community didn't do it. And so their only chances to speak their native tongue was to each other, which is really difficult when you have 4 to 6 kids ranging in age of 3 years, and those are your only connections to home. But unlike the schools that or the exchange program you set up, we stopped there. We didn't want the school didn't want any of the American students going over there. The excuse was German education system is a little bit more advanced, so those students would have a rougher time of trying to earn their credits over there because they just go at a faster pace than we do. But the main reason was because we were choosing not to prepare anybody. We were choosing to ignore the German language. We were choosing not to be inclusive to our own town or our ancestors, but we were very much in favor of bringing them here to Americanize them a bit more. So I found that very interesting that you still have that situation pertaining today.
Well, I have to say that the Germans all speak English anyway. And I was in Germany actually last week, and there are so many English words in front of which they put a der or das, that the language is infused with English now.
You are absolutely correct. It's just more interesting that while they are very much promoting the idea of developing and understanding, our exchange program just left it at, you can understand our culture, we're not going to try to understand yours. And so I feel like that is something that does happen throughout the United States. I remember a professor of mine in undergrad had told me that it was very common for German exchange programs to really want to focus on bringing Americans over to change that constant idea that has been perpetuated since World War II. And so it's a major goal of Germany today to prove to the rest of the world, come look at where we are, see that we have grown, and see that we have developed. And so I think there is still this tinge of anti-Germanness in the United States where it's still not completely okay to be 100% proud of your heritage just simply because of the negative connotations that have taken place within the last 100 years.
I have to tell you all, if I may take this opportunity to share, I got a call yesterday from a very good friend with whom I spent a week in Berlin. She was just calling to see that I had gotten back all right and so forth. And I told her about this seminar. And she said, are you going to talk about the Holocaust? And I said, no, not really. And she said, well, we know in Germany that the Americans weren't so great to their Jews either. When I think about it, there were sections of Nashville that had covenants that didn't allow Jews. There were signs that went up, like at the swimming pool in Franklin, that said no dogs or Jews allowed. The Belmead Country Club didn't allow Jews until just recently, in the last decade or so, I think, that a Jewish man joined and a black man joined at the same time. So anti-Semitism, which I said at the outset, has always been a dynamic, even though it is not right in your face, it's there.
All right. One of my last questions, and I believe, Doug, you'll be able to touch mostly on this. Did community life return to normal after the war, or were there lasting ramifications?
I was going to move all the way to the final question, that is, what is Nashville's German community like today? I don't really believe that there were long-lasting ramifications of any of this. I honestly don't. I'll speak just right now for today and the German community here. There really is no identifiable German community in Nashville. The Germans tend to assimilate quickly. If there are a lot of Germans in Nashville, Vanderbilt Medical School faculty, professors at the various universities, people who are here on business with Volkswagen in Chattanooga, or the management teams. There are really lots of Germans in Nashville, but they're totally wanting to assimilate. They let me speak German. They let me practice my German on them when they come to see me, but other than that, I'd be interested to know if any of you could hazard a guess as to where the closest thing to an intact German community is in Tennessee. Anybody have a guess about that? Clarksville. Now, why would that be?
The U.S. military.
That's correct. Most people who do what I do, that is German consular work, the reason they have a lot of customers is they're near a U.S. military base where I call them my war brides. They come to see me, and they're selling property in Germany or have estate matters and need to have paper stamped that are authenticated by a German consular official. But I think the German folks here now are so assimilated, so fluent in English as a rule. I disagree with our host. I don't think that the memories of World War I and World War II have anything to do with the fact that German's not taught in the high schools. I think it's always been, in this part of the world, there just weren't enough Germans here, unlike St. Louis, where I had cousins, or Cincinnati, where there was pretty much on equal footing with French and Spanish in the high schools. But now it's just not considered useful enough. Usually comes in fourth after Spanish, French, and now even Chinese, which I quickly say I think it's kind of idiotic. I don't think you can learn enough Chinese in a high school class to do you any good, but it's kind of the flavor, the fashion to teach Chinese, and even Arabic. But, I have a master's in German and love learning it just because of the language and the literature and whatnot. But so to answer your question, Amy, I don't think there were long-lasting consequences in this community from the experiences of World War I, even World War II. This country changed so much between World War I and World War II, just the modernity of the society, how many people were coming and going. What's the word for that? Mobility, excuse me. Yeah, I knew there was a word for that. And like I say, today, you don't see it. I mean, there's massive German investment in Tennessee. I don't know whether you're aware of that. Over $5 billion, over 16,000 jobs in Tennessee by German investment alone. The largest investor also by far is our other enemy in World War II, Japan. Yeah. I want to say 45,000 jobs. It's amazing since the 1980s. So these are both our old arch enemies, and they're all now our best friends. And so anyway, I think that the friendship between Germany and America in face of the threat from Soviet Union, and when America had 400,000 troops in Germany for a long time, or 350,000 troops, and the friendships that were formed, and marriages and families, the two societies are just so intertwined and integrated now that it's hard to imagine us not being friends. And everything we did in the Marshall Plan to help rebuild their society, certainly with our own interest in mind as well. It wasn't completely charitable, but anyway, that's my Schwanengesang. That's my swan song. So,
do you ladies have anything to add?
I don't have any comments. I think that Germantown, the mobility issue, as Doug said, the automobile came along and the suburbs were built. And so, it's the American way. If you've got land, you spread out as far as you can. And so I think that it really wasn't the war that caused the disintegration of Germantown. I think it was the culture of the United States.
From the Jewish point of view, World War I saw 8% of the Jewish population in Nashville go into the war. World War II saw 12%, so they were right there ready to fight for their country. In between, there was a great deal of help given to particularly emigres who came trying to escape what was happening in Germany. Some of you may know of the May family here in Nashville. Some of you may have even bought socks there when you were young. And the May family brought over 52 people that I have documented. It's one of those things where the story kind of grew. They always said they brought over 200. And I said, well, is there a list? Who are these people? And I did a lot of research, and it turned out that there were 52 documented people that they basically sponsored, saying that they would not become welfare recipients in the state. But again, it was hard for them to get visas for these people. But that was, between the wars, the big focus for the Nashville Jewish community, to try and bring over as many people as possible. And then after the war, there were a number of people who came who had survived concentration camps. And if you have a moment when you're along Highway 70 and you go toward the JCC and go through the entranceway, immediately to your left is a Holocaust memorial with the names of all of these people that were associated in some way with Nashville Jewish families. If you haven't been there, I think it's worth the time just to go and feel the intensity of the solemnity of that memorial.
All right, well, before we wrap things up, we'll just have a few minutes in case anybody has questions. Ken will be walking around with a microphone. We just ask that you wait for it to get to you because this is being recorded. So if you don't have the microphone, the camera won't be able to pick you up. So if you have any questions, please feel free. All right, well, that was easy. Well, you all have a wonderful...
A question.
I was just going to make a book recommendation here in the library. A very colorful Banner author, Ed Huddleston, put a book together called Big Wheels, Little Wagons, and he elaborates on the new Huff family, the meatpacking business in early Nashville days quite a bit. It's very interesting, partly because of his style of writing. It's very colorful and fun to read, but highly recommended.
Yes, Ed Huddleston wrote for the Banner in the 1950s, and he published these articles, which he ultimately printed in a booklet, Big Wheels and Little Wagons, and it's charming. It's got very nice drawings, pen and ink drawings in it, and the very colorful tales.
Well, I have a question for the audience. Raise your hand if you have German heritage. Not too many. I used to get students whose mothers were what you were referring to, the war brides and so forth. And actually, those were sometimes the worst students. They had grown up with prayers and courtesy phrases that they knew, and that was the ceiling. They didn't go beyond that. But anyway, when I started teaching German in the 60s, probably most of the students that I had some kind of German background. Wow. And now there were only a few of you who actually had German ancestry, so I guess we're just very diverse.
I have seen almost 1,000 customers in 15 years of being German consul, and of those who are moved here as wives of American soldiers, there are none, not a single one, whose children or grandchildren speak German. Not one. I've not met any. There may be some who've tried to teach, who've kept that up, but a little bit different with the younger generation, folks at Vanderbilt and whatnot, who are maybe not going to stay here that long, but talk about one. And most have given up their German citizenship. It's now possible to it's easier now to have dual citizenship. So some now do retain their German citizenship. Anyway.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We do really appreciate it. And I do want to just take one final moment to thank the panelists for being here and adding your voice to the conversation. It was truly valuable, and you definitely made this event. So thank you.
Thank you.